The Analects by Confucius is my topic for today. I have many reasons to talk about this, great book. A couple of reasons are my reasons. So I have to tell you that it was the very first philosophical book I read. When I was 13, I, I had a translation into my native language of this book from Chinese, and it was in the library of my sister. And I read this book, and for some reasons, it was so fascinating for me that I would rewrite some fragments and learn by heart. It was a bit crazy, but especially that I was 13, but I remember till this time that I was doing that. Later on, and this is the second reason, when I studied American pragmatism, I learned that there is an interesting interconnection between such different cultural and philosophical movements as American pragmatism and Chinese Confucianism. Namely, one of the most representative figures of American pragmatism, John Dewey, visited China in 1919 and 1920 and gave lectures over there. And the Chinese audiences were really fascinated with that. And some of the people, Chinese scholars probably, they called Dewey a second Confucius. And it was because American pragmatism and John Dewey and Confucius and Confucianism, they focused upon similar things a little bit. Moral education, approach to politics, which is rearrangement of political institutions by means of rearrangement of characters. In other words, you have a good character of people, you will have good institutions, political, educational, and so on. So it was this, I would say, this point. Third thing that is connected with my life and professional life at the same time, these are my Chinese students. For a couple of years now, I've been giving classes of rhetoric and persuasion and other courses to Chinese students who mainly they are in mainland China, and I give them courses online. And teaching them or trying to teach them how to discuss, how to talk, how to exchange opinions in the Western style. I have problems all the time because they don't want to do it, because they think that silence, not discussing, but silence is the proper attitude of the students in the classroom. And I started to think about that, and I realized much of this is in this book, that when you are students, you should wait and learn until you have something, I would say, important to say, that you have some knowledge and so on. So it's striking. In other words, willing to understand my Chinese students more, I studied this, Confucius, And so a few words about the book. Well, it is written, it is not a really big book because, as you can see, I have Chinese version and my native language version. Sometimes it is one sentence per page. So it is very characteristic that you may say these are separate sentences, separate fragments of conversation with a powerful message, powerful philosophical thought. And the main, I would say, message is the moral message. But what's the difference between the Chinese and Western? I have a feeling that if I were to tell you in one word, I would say dynamics. Our Western culture and our notion of morality is very dynamic, that it evolves, it changes. Whereas what I can see here, it is static, it is fixed. The message of Confucianism as philosophy, I would say, is something like this. There is, let me use the metaphor of house. House represents the whole universe. And everything in the house, the structured edifice has regularities, everything has its place. And also the people living in the house, they have their own places. The son must be the son, father must be the father, wife must be the wife. And the boss, if we extend this metaphor, the boss must be the boss, and the king must be the king. Everybody has his or her position that is not that changeable, not that dynamic. And you would have to learn, that's why knowledge here is very important, you would have to learn your place. And it does not mean you have to talk a lot about this. You should know your place and then realize your mission. But mission, I would say, it's not social mission. It is just your job to do good things as a son, as a father, and so on. And realization of this way is something that has also a public meaning. It is not just individual meaning, it has public meaning, because you cultivate this universal structure as it should be. So Confucianism, understood as a sort of philosophy of life or approach towards everything that is around, and also a political stance, and maybe if we use Western language, we could say it is a sort of religion, although there is no God, but it has a religious attitude because it respects the universal laws, and it shows you that your place has a kind of universal meaning because you are a part of universe. And the unity and the structure of this universe has something very important. So I will read you a very short quote that represents this mentality that is very different from what we have in the West nowadays. Please listen to this. Do not be concerned that no one recognizes your merits. Be concerned that you may not recognize others. In other words, it's so different to me. It shows that Confucianism focuses upon your internal job. Maybe it's a little bit similar to Stoicism, maybe. But generally, recognition of your place and recognition of your good job in doing things is very important here. So one of the striking differences I can see between Confucianism here and our Western culture is individualism. They do talk about individualism, but it's very different. Namely, I would say this Chinese individualism is not so egocentric, it's not so, I would say, anarchistic a little bit, and definitely it does not recognize the need that everybody should have his or her an opinion about everything. So this is what I can say in my students when they don't want to talk about their opinions. Whereas the students from Western countries, everybody's talking about opinions and commenting other opinions, and reference to knowledge is not so important. So I would say that Confucianism would say, wait and learn. And when you achieve some level of knowledge, some level of experience, some level of, being able to do the public service, for example, then you can talk a little bit about that. But before that, your opinion is just an opinion, and who cares? For me, it is very interesting to compare Western rhetoric and Chinese rhetoric, or eloquence, the role of argumentation in the way of when you speak in public speech. So I was really surprised when I learned that both my students, but this book recommends not to talk too much. And my personal experience is that in order to learn how to talk during the course of rhetoric, for example, you have to talk, you have to discuss, you have to exchange opinions. But what to do with the culture that does not recommend that, and instead, this is interesting, instead it recommends rhetoric of silence. That silence is something that has meaning, whereas in our culture, contemporary culture at least, silence is something, you do not have your voice, or maybe you are oppressed, or maybe you don't want to talk for some reason, those who do not talk, who are silent as if are suspicious, because maybe they are victims of something, or maybe they are bad guys or something like that. But here is just a recommendation that silence may mean something, and we should respect silence, because silence is not emptiness. Silence is something that you have your own system of values, but you don't want to talk about this, for example, because you think it's obvious. And the second, perhaps you are not the best guy who is predisposed to talk about that. So maybe you should ask, if you want to talk about my culture, you should ask, for example, Confucius or other authority figures, not me. Silence means here that we don't have to reduce talking about very important things to chatting, to something, like ordinary discussion, everyday opinions or something like that. Also for me it was very strange to learn how much Confucianism has in common with contemporary China, contemporary communist China as well. I mean mainland China and non-communist China as well, like Taiwan, Hong Kong and so on, Singapore. But very interesting is to learn that the book recommends, and Confucianism recommends, subordination to authority. And it is authority in politics, like, president, king, whatever, but also authority in family. I think the Chinese society, as far as I know, and this book says that, has or recognizes the hierarchy, social hierarchy, right? And family is an important part of this hierarchy. So one of the basic things, which is very different from what we have in Western world nowadays, is that if you are young, you have no experience, you should follow this hierarchy, you should respect authority. And it is not a very important thing if it is, your father, if it is your boss, if it is your president or something. It is authority. And we don't have to discuss too much about it because it is authority. And authority does not mean something imposed, something military, something like that. From this, what I get is that authority means governing. And governing means recognition and respecting the rules. I have a quote here, short one. Governance is setting things upright. If you lead with uprightness, who will dare not to be upright? So I understand this as governance, the rules. These are very similar things, and we should respect that. So government does not mean just accidental people who had power, but these are people like father at home that is responsible for the well-being of society, as father in this culture is responsible for well-being of the family. It does not mean that father is always right. It does not mean that. Sometimes he is wrong, but generally he is responsible for the well-being, for being upright as far as his family is concerned. And the same refers to the political power.